Hello, we're at the Amnesty International In Solidarity, in Defiance event in support of the Arab Spring. And I'm here with Dina again, Now Dina, in your speech you talked about what's currently happening in Egypt. The strikes of school children. Tell us something about that.
Yeah, the strikes of school children are the most inspiring things, at least to me on a personal level. There are at least students from at least 100 high schools who have decided to walk out of school today, or at least for 3 days, and to march out throughout Cairo. They're striking in opposition to SCAF, actually.
That's the military council that's still ruling Egypt,
it's the Supreme Council of Armed Forces, which is basically the military council that's taken over from Mubarak until today. I think these school children have especially been moved by the very recent massacre of football fans, and because a lot of the football fans were very young. Some of them were actually school children themselves, 15 years and so on. And so it was a message to SCAF: you kill one of us, there are hundreds of us that are going to come out.
Now what happened there with the massacre?
Well, the massacre is still being investigated so far, but the parliamentary commission that has investigated it has said that there was serious breaches of security, to the extent that it seems that it is being plotted by the security itself. A lot of people have actually given SCAF the responsibility of this, whether directly because of being, causing this because of how Al Ahly fans have been very vocal against the regime in their chants, or indirectly by really neglecting security to the extent that we can see that the recent number that was actually published yesterday is not 73, there are 194 young people killed in this massacre. It's an enraging situation, and it has made every single person walk out, including those very young school children or school students, not to call them children, really.
So why is the SCAF still in power when there's already been democratic elections?
Sure. There has been elections only in parliament. There hasn't been elections on presidential elections. They haven't handed power. They're in power because they have interest, because they're part of the old regime. SCAF controls 40% of the economy. They have industries that produce everything from crisps and snacks to aircrafts and ammunition. So they have an interest to stay in power and to keep the power system as it is in place. And it's true. I mean, they haven't reformed the security. They haven't reformed the judiciary. None of the calls, the workers' calls for a minimum wage haven't been responded to. It is really the old regime. It is the same.
And those who are now potentially in power, those who've been elected to power, the Muslim Brotherhood and the other parties, what is their attitude to the military council?
The Muslim Brotherhood is a very conservative party. They are reformists. They're not revolutionaries. And so they've always tried to play on both sides. They always try to, we say, handle the stick from the middle, really, So they would call on SCAF to, take more responsibilities for its actions, but wouldn't push too far. But I think they are actually being pushed by the streets to take on more roles. So for example, just last week there was another massacre. 12 more people were killed in protesting in front of the state security. And at the beginning, the Muslim Brotherhood members of parliament weren't acknowledging that there were ammunitions being shot at people. And until some members of the parliament got evidence and the street came out seriously, forcefully, more and more protests, they had to finally recognize this and call the Minister of Interior responsible. It is a long battle. It's a long battle with people in parliament who are not necessarily representative of everything. Parliaments are never representative of anything, from all over the world, right? They're representative of money and power. And so it's a long battle of the street to push parliament to actually take more responsibility. But in fact, to keep the revolution out on the street is the most important one.
Now, talking of that, if you read some of the Western media, you get the impression that there was a dictatorship, and then suddenly in Tahrir, some people went into Tahrir Square and the revolution started. Whereas in fact there were a lot of labour struggles. There was very powerful struggle for many years against the regime. What's happening now in those terms?
Yeah. I think I'm a labour researcher, in fact. So my PhD is on public sector workers. And one of the most fascinating things for me has been the role of workers. I mean, we've seen, you're very correct to say, we've seen uprisings from 2006 to 2011 that were unbelievable. But the militancy and the radicalism we're seeing the protests with today is very telling. And I think it's telling because I mean, the right-wing economic policies are still the same and people are still as deprived as before. But the radicalism we've seen, especially people like contract workers, temporary workers, they've been cutting roads like the piqueteros, you know, in Latin America. They've been sleeping under the train tracks, taking management hostage. I mean, really radical measures because their voices haven't been heard. And so, if anything, we're seeing an upping up in the tactics and the amount of protests and strikes. And the result is today, actually, I wasn't imagining we were going to see so many workplaces actually joining the general strike. And they've joined.
General strike today?
Yeah. It is, yeah, so that was what I was trying to say in my speech. So the general strike starts today. They've joined. Some of them have called openly for SCAF to step down. Some of them have just called for their own demands, you know, of a minimum wage, higher pay, and so on, which is still, I think, a way to destabilize SCAF, even if, you know, you don't call directly for SCAF to step out.
Okay, another question really interests me. Given the ferment of labour unrest, why did parties of the secular left not win the election?
Yeah, because you could ask the same thing here, right? How come we've had two protests with over, I think, 1 million people march, and there is a parliament with right-wing, you know, leaning? Because I think, you know, parliaments are never representative. These elections particularly were done very rushedly. They were opened 3 weeks, I think, before. There was no limitations on who can get funding and who couldn't. And I know the coalition of the left, of which I have friends who are part of it, have worked so hard. But, you know, if you don't have the money and you don't have the time to build, then, of course, you're going to reproduce the old structures. So,
Dina, thank you very, very much. This is Richard Hearing for Vision on TV here in Trafalgar Square.